So on this episode of the podcast, I'm speaking with Cameron Wyllie. Cameron was the principal of George Heriot School, which has been named Scotland's Independent School of the Decade. During that time, he, among many other things, he ran the debating club at the school and coached the debating side for Scotland. Cameron, welcome to the podcast.
Hello, Zack.
So what did you most enjoy about your teaching career? Because you were an English teacher at Heriot's before you became the head teacher and then principal of the senior school. What did you enjoy about teaching?
Yeah, so there were three things that I did in my career, really. The first one was I taught classroom English. The second one was, well, maybe four, actually. The second one was that I was in charge of various good bits of pastoral care. The third one was I was a senior administrator of schools. I was head of the senior school. I was a principal. And then also I did do debating in a pretty big way as my extracurricular activity. Of these things in declining order, I enjoyed the English teaching most. I did enjoy the pastoral care, and I certainly enjoyed the debating. I think I'm not really a natural administrator. I'm not really a person manager either, I think, really. So the bits that I enjoyed least were probably bits to do with admin, but I actually enjoyed being the principal because I got to do the admissions work and bring people into the school.
And now that you're in retirement, you've sort of kept up with, something related to the debating, I think, in terms of your blog where you write about articles on, why don't you tell us, what is your blog about and what kind of articles do you write on there?
So I started a blog on the advice of a former pupil of mine who is himself a writer on the basis that I wanted to write a book. And he suggested that I should blog first. I think partly in order to ensure that I could actually write at all, and secondly, to work up an audience that might eventually be interested in reading a book rather than starting from zero. So that's what I did. So for the past 3 years, I have been blogging. My blog is www.ahouseinjoppa.wordpress.com. And I blog about two things, essentially. First of all, about education, because I write about education for the Scotsman, for Scotland on Sunday, occasionally for Holyrood magazine. And then I also write about other things that interest me, usually sort of personal things, some gay stuff, some cultural stuff, some things to do with traveling and so on and so forth. So basically it's about half about rants about education and half of it's just things that strike me in the course of the day.
Something I've always wondered is you write sometimes about the attainment gap in education, and I wonder about how you first started to be interested in that.
Well, I suppose I became interested in it for two reasons. First of all, because Heriot, as you will know, has a fairly distinctive historical background to do with the foundation. So Heriot was established in the 17th century as what was effectively a school for orphans, or certainly for fatherless or indeed motherless children. They were all educated free, and the school has continued that tradition through to the present day. So at the present day at Heriot, there are about 80 children who benefit from the foundation. They're educated free, and they have lost one or other of their parents. Mm-hmm. These children, in order to be foundationers, must come from backgrounds where there isn't a lot of money. And it was very interesting indeed to see how the foundationers did in the context of what was otherwise an essentially upper middle class, pretty academic school. Mm-hmm. In some ways, I was interested in it because Heriot has been, as I've often said, closing the attainment gap, the poverty-related attainment gap, for 400 years. The other reason I was interested in it was because it's become a plank of the SNP government's, the central plank of the SNP government's education policy. And while I think that closing the poverty-related attainment gap is a really creditable thing to want to do, I think two things. It's A, it's very difficult, and B, I'm not absolutely sure it should be the central plank of anybody's education policy.
No, and why is that?
Well, because I think the central plank of anybody's education policy should be to ensure that every child under the care of the nation's educators does as well as they possibly can. Mm-hmm. That is almost slightly at odds with the closure of the poverty-related attainment gap. I mean, well, the two things can work together, but I think that the overriding thing should be that we recognise that everybody has the right to be educated as well as they possibly can be.
So is there a sense that sometimes when there's these debates about education policy, they do get very politically charged? I wonder if you find that having been interested in debating helps with navigating those sorts of discussions?
I think being interested in debating probably helps you navigate any kind of discussion that has an argumentative basis, because it does help you see both sides of the argument, and it certainly helps you reinforce your own side of the argument. Back in the days when I was teaching debating, if I was talking to a group of 10-year-olds, I would say that they should be interested in debating because it would help them win arguments against their parents. And I think broadly that's true. Indeed, I met parents who would actually say to me, well, we're pleased that he's become a debater, but it's not so much fun that when we're debating what time you're going to come home at night and stuff like that, or what you can get for Christmas. So I think that an interest in debating obviously helps you understand argument. The other side of that is, of course, that an interest in debating makes you capable of arguing any side of anything. And in fact, in my view, it might be the case that British politics in particular would have benefited if it had a few less school debaters involved in it. I mean, the current Prime Minister of the UK seems to me to absolutely highlight the dangers of schools debating or university debating. I mean, he could argue anything. I mean, he could just argue anything, regardless of its moral justification or his personal belief.
Yeah, and being able to argue anything, what are the principles for the things that you should argue for? And maybe we can get a little bit more into that when we're talking about the attainment gap. So I've been looking about how the SNP government measure the attainment gap, and it sounds like they basically say, for whatever benchmark, here are the 20% most income. This is how many people are meeting this benchmark. Here's the lowest 20%. Here's how many people are meeting that benchmark. And then the difference between those two, that's the gap. And that's what we want to minimize. And that seems to me to be quite a rudimentary way of looking at education. Well, would you agree with that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the point is that there are all sorts of problems with the closure of the poverty-related attainment gap. The central one, I think, is that it's far too monocentric about what it is it's trying to measure. Mm-hmm. So, for example, it might be the case that you said, let's look at the percentage of people who can get higher English in any one year. So I don't know what, 80% of upper middle class children get it, and 40% in the bottom 20%, and we need to do something about that. Now, of course, that's true, but that presupposes that the most important thing in every young person's life is their capacity to get academic qualifications. And that just presents a very limited view of what educational achievement should be about, and indeed what intelligence is, I think. I mean, it's sort of, I think, kind of patronizing. I think it's kind of saying, well, I've done a university degree, I've done a master's degree, I'm a PhD in educational theory, and I can tell you, you could aspire to this level of achievement as well. When in fact, I think it's perfectly all right for somebody to say, actually, I can build a bookcase out of bits of scrap wood in a way that you couldn't possibly do, Mr. PhD. And I think that too is a very impressive achievement. I think we have to recognize that different people excel in different ways, and that these things are very, very, very difficult to measure. And that basically saying that this is all about whether or not people can get their hires isn't actually terribly relevant.
Mm-hmm. Well, what would you say if someone was to argue against that and say, well, actually, these qualifications are really important. We know that if people don't leave school with these academic qualifications, they tend to not do as well in life, whether you measure that in terms of health outcomes or their future income. Is there a different way to look at that?
Well, there's a different way to look at it, because actually part of the reason for this is the way that we kind of appreciate people in society. I mean, we've got to actually start appreciating everybody and praising people who do a good job or who work hard. and encouraging that as a kind of social value in a way that we simply don't do at the moment. So basically, we deem success in two ways. You're successful because you're a doctor. So if you say, I'm a doctor, people are impressed by that. I'm successful because I was the principal of a school. People, kind of go, oh, right, okay. So, they can see them kind of marking you up in some way and the other way, of course, is money. So that you're successful if you're deemed to be a success, you're deemed to have done well if you've got a super yacht. So there are these two things which are quite often at odds, because I tell you, Zack, as a doctor, you'll never own a super yacht. Those two things which are slightly at odds with each other, are rather than saying than valuing people in other ways by saying, do they do whatever it is they do well? That seems to me to be an important thing. I'm constantly amazed, for example, that we regard. I think perhaps foolishly that there's not really all that much distinction between dentists and car mechanics. What is the distinction there? They're both doing important work and doing it variously well or unwell. It's that we should be concentrating on. People's capacity to do something competently.
Mm-hmm. And does this link to I'm just wondering what that would look like if we valued a greater range of achievement. Is this what people talk about in the news about valuing vocational qualifications and that kind of stuff?
The bottom line is that in my view, and this is all completely anecdotal, and I have to remember all the time, as no doubt some people who listen to this, assuming people do, would agree. My perception of this comes from through the lens of somebody who only ever works in private schools. So for a lot of people, and I don't think this is completely unreasonable, my views on education more broadly aren't terribly relevant or terribly informed. But that said, you have to, allow yourself to be in a situation where you accept that in a lot of school classrooms, there's not a lot happening that's very valuable. I think probably the current education system in Scotland, across the whole piece of state education, probably works pretty well for about the middle 60%, because it just doesn't work very well for the top 20% or the bottom 20%. And for a lot of people, including people in the 60%, this is not just about the least academically able people, they would be better served by doing a lot more vocational education. Basically, the things you want in the education system is you want people to be very highly literate and numerate. So you want them to have these things, and we need to pound away at these things to make sure that works. There is no marker more important in closing the poverty-related attainment gap than literacy. That would be that's a big thing. That said, after that, you're better to eventually start to say to people, look, do you actually, do you need to go to university? Why do you need to go to university? So many people go to university, and it's such a waste of time for them, waste of time and other people's money. And we'd be much, much better off looking at much more extensive, high quality, expensive vocational training and a very, very much wider extension of apprenticeship.
Something I also wonder about is whether schools could do more to teach people about the world of business and about how to sell things online, how to develop a brand on social media, these sorts of new skills, which are, I think, increasingly important, and with the power of social media to basically, explode somebody's following if they trigger the algorithm in the right way.
Well, I think that's right. I think that schools are making a bit of an effort to do that kind of thing. There's a lot of interest in entrepreneurship and a massive rise in the proportion of people doing business education. I agree with that broadly, but you do have to recognize also that because of the way in which technology changes very, very, very quickly, it tends to be the case that young people won't take lessons in technology from older people, quite rightly. I can't download Google Chrome to open your link. Why should I teach you anything about technology? It doesn't make any sense at all. So there's a sort of, I'm not absolutely sure that schools directly are the places for this, or at least it would have to be worked through very carefully.
Just to get into the sort of the discussion around private schools specifically, because, as the principal of, one of the most successful private schools in Scotland, people, from my experience of speaking about education at universities, there is this sense that private schools are the problem, or it's this segregation of children very early that causes all of these inequalities. And I'm guessing that you probably don't fully agree with that view.
No, I do agree with this. I do agree with this. Actually, I think a great deal of pressure should be placed on private schools to accept many, many, many more children on bursarial or scholarship aid, so that you get more people into private schools. And I mean, a long time ago, Winnie Ewing, the SNP MP for Hamilton, who went on to be a member of the European Parliament and also the MP for Murray and Nairn, I think. She said an interesting thing, which was that she didn't really approve of private schools, but she wouldn't get rid of them because they should just wither on the vine. I mean, at the end of the day, if Scottish education was as good as it should be, people shouldn't want to be paying money to send their children to private schools. I think that there's also a great deal of talk, as you may know, about Finland as being a model of excellent education. And people on the left quite often say, because one of the great things about Finland is there are no private schools. Actually, that's not true at all. There are no fee-paying schools. There are private schools, but the government pays for them. And that's the system I would advocate. I'd advocate a situation in which there's a huge degree of variety in the different kind of schools you can send your children to, or to which children can go. That's a slightly different way of expressing it. And the government pays for them all. I mean, that seems to me to be entirely fair. But definitely the kind of model of education which is offered here in Edinburgh by the Merchant Company schools and by schools like Heriot and Edinburgh Academy, that's a good model of education for academically capable children. And I don't see why we should do away with that in a current climate where I don't think that the needs of academically able children are really being met very successfully in some state schools.
There is a danger in these discussions of bringing your own background into things. And I think that I'm about to fall into that trap. But if that model was done away with, the one that we have here, I would not have benefited. So, my mum was not able to afford the fees at George Heriot's, and I was there on a bursary. And I think if I hadn't been, then probably wouldn't be studying medicine right now. Definitely wouldn't have got into Cambridge. Which is very lucky to be able to do. So I do worry if that gets changed. So if the government's not following, a Finland model, and they're not doing what you think they should be doing, well, what are they doing at the moment? I wonder if we could talk about what the government strategy is and what the effects of their focus on closing this poverty-related attainment gap are actually doing.
Well, they're not closing the poverty-related attainment gap. The poverty-related attainment gap, and this is not entirely obviously the government's fault, will be wider now than it was when they started the policy. I think there's no doubt about that. And part of the reason for that is, of course, to do with the pandemic, because the pandemic's been disastrous for less academically able children, children at more from schools with areas of multiple deprivation, and children who are not equipped to deal with home learning. I mean, it's just been a disaster for them. And I think probably retrospectively we'll have to accept that the government didn't do quite enough to support these children, but they did try. So the first thing is they're not closing the poverty-related attainment gap. Now, the second question is, what is it that they're doing in education at the moment? Well, the answer is not very much. As an opposition MSP put it to me recently, the Cabinet Secretary for Education will be deemed to be doing a good job if she's never on page 1 or 2 of the newspapers. And that's correct. I mean, at the end of the day, the SNP simply doesn't want to do very much in any particular area of public policy prior to the solving or the next stage of the constitutional question. So basically, they don't want to alienate teachers, they don't want to alienate parents, they don't want to alienate 16, 17 and 18-year-old voters by doing all that much in education. And what's happening, therefore, is not a crisis. It's not like a natural disaster in education. It's just a very, very slow decline, which is almost imperceptible. It's a bit more like getting older or something. A very slow decline is taking place in Scottish educational standards. And that's a very serious problem. But I don't think that the radical vision that's necessary to do something about that is going to emerge, certainly not prior to independence or the fairly clear designation by the Scottish people we don't want independence. So one of these two things has to happen. At the moment, we're teetering a bit, and because of that and because of COVID, nothing very much is happening.
Just to push on that a little bit, I suspect that the standard response from the government would be something along the lines of, well, the OECD report into our education policy found that we've got a very, very good idea about the curriculum for excellence. It's a very good plan. It's just that we haven't fully implemented it yet, and we're making such and such commitments to do that by 2020, whatever. I mean, what's the response to that?
Well, I think, first of all, the point is that anyone who watched the online visual presentation about the OECD report when it was launched will have been struck by the way in which the very senior European academics who were involved all praised the system and then really tore into it and said, it's not working very well. Well, at the end of the day, you want something to work. I personally actually don't think curriculum for excellence is a very successful educational model to begin with. I think the theory was wrong. I think there are probably significant forces in the SNP government that realised that. It wasn't the SNP government, of course, who brought in curriculum for excellence. It was the Labour Party that brought it in. But to be fair, every political party backed it for reasons that I really don't understand. And there's still... I think it's fair to say there's still not a political party that's actually saying, look, if we were in power, we'd do away with curriculum for excellence and we'd move to some other model, because they just don't know what that model would be. Can
you explain what curriculum for excellence means to people that might not know about?
The difficulty is that calling curriculum for excellence is part of the problem. It's a bit like saying, I've got a racehorse called Jack, when in fact what you own is a cat called Moggy. Curriculum for excellence isn't a curriculum, and it certainly isn't about, it may have an aspiration towards excellence, but it certainly hasn't achieved that. So a curriculum is that thing where I say, right, here are the things you're going to learn. You're going to learn all this, Zack. This is higher biology. Here's the curriculum for higher biology. And as an aside, let me say that that's a huge problem for curriculum for excellence, because what they discovered was that curriculum for excellence didn't really work in the exam years. You've got to have a proper curriculum, an exam curriculum for each examination subject. Now, the problem is that what they've decided to do is they've decided to say, well, we need to take a look at this again and make sure that curriculum for excellence does work in the exam years, when in fact, a very sensible first step would be to say, curriculum for excellence in junior education replaced what was called the 5 to 14 curriculum. It would be much more sensible just to have curriculum for excellence up to 14. It can achieve all its aims, or try to achieve all its aims, that's a big if, by the time you're 14. And then you can start doing exams, or you could start doing a program of vocational education, or you could go to a gifted and talented school and play the violin or learn how to be an even better goalkeeper, or whatever. These are all these exciting options of post-14 education in Scotland. But actually what you've got at the moment is curriculum for excellence up to 18, set against examinations which aren't curriculum for excellence examinations. I mean, they were supposed to be changed into curriculum for excellence. But given that curriculum for excellence is, for example, about examining how confident you are or how socially conscious you are, how does that fit into higher physics? Well, you can see a bit of stretch. You might have a question that kind of vaguely relates to, say, energy consumption or something like that, which has a kind of social consciousness attached to it. But basically, we need people to continue to get things like hires and advanced hires in hard science subjects, so they can, for example, go on to be doctors. I
mean, it's almost sounding like it's been a little bit of a social experiment about whether you can do away with
a social experiment. Yes, exactly. It's all about social experiment. I mean, the presumption of mainstreaming, which is another horrible thing in Scottish education at the moment. I mean, the presumption of mainstreaming seems to me to be almost the antithesis of what it should be. I mean, basically, rather than saying, well, we're just going to assume that everybody's going to go to the local school, what you should be doing is saying, let's just think about what school every individual should go to. You know, what's the best educational outcome for them, you know, within some financial limits. But of course, we don't spend anything like enough on education. So I mean, all of this is to do with social experimentation. I mean, it's all to do with social, a lot of it's to do with social experimentation and to do with the idea of having a kind of Scottish society that works in a particular kind of way. One of the comparisons that I make a lot is with health, and both in terms of costs and the way we look at it, for example. You know, the expectations of a school classroom are very, very different to the expectations of a hospital ward. If your child goes into a hospital ward to have their broken leg mended, you know, that's what the hospital's there to do. And we actually need to look at schools, to a certain extent at least, as having a function to perform. And that function is something to do with teaching people stuff and making sure that they are ready to go out and work, rather than all the things which schools are currently supposed to do.
The parallels between health and education, I think, are worth spending a little bit of time on, because something that I've...
you know, that.
Yeah, and I've really noticed that one similarity is that it seems to be that when the public sector and the policymakers want to do something, it's very difficult to actually make that happen in practice. And I think the way to start off exploring that thread is about what you said about the SNP not really wanting to rock the boat, not wanting to alienate people. That seems to me just to be a bit stupid, really, because if you wanted to get support for independence, then surely the way to do that is to be really, really good at running the Scottish policy. You know, it just seems like to back off from doing that is obviously going to be counterproductive, isn't it?
Well, not as things stand at the moment. I mean, the SNP's record in government is pretty patchy. There are some very good things that they've done. The doubling, the introduction, and then the doubling of the Scottish child payment, for example, is a very good thing. I like lots of the little health measures that they've brought in. I like the fact I don't pay for my prescriptions, etc., 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 etc. There's lots and lots of individual little things that they've done that are absolutely fine.
And you say this as someone who is a traditional supporter of the SNP, is that? Well, not. Right?
I think I'm not. I think what you mean is who traditionally supports the SNP, or who usually supports the SNP, and that's right. I certainly, I mean, I at the moment, I find it quite difficult to see what else I would do. And I think that's part of the problem in Scotland at the moment, is that none of the opposition parties is strong at all. And therefore, I mean, since Ruth Davidson, Baroness Davidson, left the leadership of the Scottish Conservatives, there's not really been all that much for Nicola to put up with, and therefore she can pretty much call the shots. You're absolutely right, though. I mean, and the outcome of that is that the SNP is still doing pretty well in the polls, and that Yes is doing pretty well in the polls. I don't really think they're going to rock the boat. That's what I think, and I think that's although I agree, if they want to show us how brilliant Scotland could be when it's independent, they should be doing brilliantly on things which are completely devolved.
And so it sounds like with education, they have this idea of curriculum for excellence, but it seems to be poorly implemented. At least, you know, that's what they're saying. So why is that? Why is it poorly implemented? What are the barriers to the government actually doing what it says it should do?
Well, the first thing is it wasn't thought through very well in the first place. It was based on a model. My understanding is that it's based on a few different educational models, one of which was Australian. And it was brought. Part of the problem is the influence of academics on all this. I mean, just one of my recurrent bees in my bonnet at the moment is that the Scottish Education COVID Recovery Group has 25 people on it, and not one of them is a school teacher, a practicing school teacher. That seems to me to be extraordinarily rude and just extraordinary on every level. And people who are actually working in the places don't get a say. And do they have that?
Do they have people who are part of the teaching unions on those committees?
Yes, they do. Yeah, they do. But a trade union official is not a practicing person. And also that's a huge, I mean, the teaching unions, well, particularly specifically the EIS, is a huge problem in Scottish education at the moment because it's so reactionary. The EIS is against changing anything. except possibly teachers' salary and conditions. But it's against changing anything, and it's very, 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 very conservative with a small c, the EIS. So there are a lot of, I mean, there are just a lot of problems with curriculum for excellence based around the way it was instituted without there being anything like the degree of support. The problem with the top end, which is that it just doesn't articulate with examination subjects, and also the fact that it brings a tremendous amount into what is a very limited school day. So the question is, in my view, what we need to be doing is we need, over an extended period of time, to be asking teachers, parents, and pupils, not professors of education in Scottish universities, what it is they think young people should be learning in schools and what the priorities should be. And I would include in that, industry, employers, universities as well. I mean, what is it that our schools should be for? So we need to have a national conversation on education. That's what we need. We need a big conversation about education. There needs to be quite radical change as we continue to very, very slowly and incrementally slide down international rankings.
The other thing that I think about when you describe how these decisions are made at the moment, committees, unions, lots of documentation. This was something else in the OECD report, said that there was an incredible amount of policy direction, documentation for teachers. That's something which really rings true for health as well. And it makes me wonder, is the government philosophy at the moment about how you make change happen is just to produce an incredible amount of paper that very few people read and sit in committees where very few people make decisions? What's the alternative to that?
Well, the alternative to that is to devolve much more power to individual head teachers and individual schools, and hence to individual teachers. Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. Education Scotland delivers out any amount of policy papers that nobody reads. It's like Animal Farm. I mean, in Animal Farm, while the animals are all slaving away, the pigs sit in their offices producing sheets and sheets of paper, which at the end of the day are burnt in the furnace, and then they go to start again the next day. That's what's happening. That's an absolutely. I mean, it's not even a metaphor for Education Scotland. It is Education Scotland, effectively. Education Scotland has lots of seconded teachers in it, and I just have a bit of a feeling that probably working on your conserved salary for Education Scotland is a lot less like work than being in a classroom. I just have that feeling. I think they could get rid of Education Scotland tomorrow and not completely, save the nearly $4 million a year that it costs, spend that $4 million a year on alleviating conditions in classrooms by employing more teachers. It's about 1,100 teachers Education Scotland costs us, okay? So you could put a couple of extra teachers in all Scotland secondary schools anyway. And nobody would know the difference. You talk to head teachers, deputy head teachers, and teachers in the state sector, and you say, "Tell me about something Education Scotland's done for you recently," and they have no idea. They have absolutely no idea. It's a joke. It's like a parody of some administrative phenomena. But even though Education Scotland has been declared or been described in the Scottish Parliament as being not fit for purpose, the CEO of Education Scotland still on every educational committee you can think of, including the Scottish COVID Education Recovery Group, discredited but still there. It's a lot of nonsense. And it does worry me a wee bit as somebody who actually basically wants to see an independent Scotland, that this is what it's going to be like. It's going to be full of committees of people who don't really have a clue as to what's going on in the actual circumstance because they left that behind decades before. That's what I say.
I'd never heard the comparison with Animal Farm, but I really think it works. And without wanting to take the mick too much, I take it that when you were the principal at Heriot, you weren't running the school by just issuing pieces of paper from your office. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about...
I'm not saying... I would be very, very, very far from saying that the way I ran, which I didn't really do, other people ran it really, but the way that I was very lucky with the team of people who surrounded me at Heriot, and that therefore made it all work reasonably well during the fairly brief period that I was the principal. But that all said, I mean, I wouldn't be holding up the way that my skills as a school principal as some kind of yardstick by which to measure other heads. There are great heads out in the state sector, but their hands are tied. I mean, their hands are tied. They are gagged. They're gagged. That's a better way of putting it. And they will not put their heads above the parapet. They're scared to put their heads above the parapet.
Maybe it's worth spending a bit of time asking why people are scared, because this is something I feel that junior doctors as well, to, the parallels with health, I think are very scared to raise their head above the parapet as well. I mean, what are the consequences when you do that?
Zack, the junior doctors are not the heads.
Yeah.
That's the point. A head is in charge of a school. They potentially have a great deal of power. The comparison is with the most senior doctor in the building, the hospital's general manager. These people who have a great deal of power to determine what goes on. But Scottish state education needs to be liberated so that people can actually make decisions about what's going on in their area and in their school. It's far too, I was going to say centralised. I don't think that's actually strictly true, because I eventually think that the solution will come by central government actually taking power in order to then devolve to schools and missing out local authorities. I mean, a lot of the problem, I think, lies in local authorities and their, I don't know, their innate conservatism, basically. The idea is I been thus runs through Scottish education. A child goes to school, they learn to read and write, they aspire to, they go to the local comprehensive and they do exams at the end of that. And if they don't do the exams or they don't do well in the exams, they're deemed to have failed. And that's just because they actually haven't articulated properly with the education system for a huge variety of reasons, some of which are to do with social deprivation and to do with poverty. So what you do is you spend a lot more money and you tailor much more education towards people so they have fulfilling outcomes. And if you did that, then of course you would have less unemployment, you'd have less health issues, you'd have less policing issues, and eventually all the money that you poured into education would come back.
I do want to go back to this question about not so much your own skills as a head, but the system of running the school at George Heriot's, which is a very successful school. Is there answers in that to the problem of how do you actually run schools as a system? And I wonder if what's the secret behind the success of Heriot's?
I may eventually write a book about this, or I might eventually, I don't know, it won't be a book, but write something about it. The answer to that question is there isn't an earthly reason at all why every school in Scotland, properly resourced and financed, couldn't run on the model that is provided both by some private schools, not all. I'm not suggesting that every school in Scotland should be run like Fetties, but by some private schools, or indeed by some successfully run state schools. So you just have boards of governors of interested parties from the community as forming a board. That board has an influence over and some power over the head teacher, but broadly speaking, they're there to support the head teacher who would be properly remunerated. So that's quite an important aspect of it. You'd bring in, some people would hopefully come into headmastering or whatever you're going to call it, head teaching, from different sectors. I'm always been of the view, for example, that I don't really believe that the person who runs a school needs to necessarily be a teacher. And so so you could have all sorts of models existing in local situations monitored locally. And a lot of these things would be quite simple to do. And indeed, a lot of these things don't necessarily need to be expensive. One of my particular things, which I've talked about endlessly now to politicians who all express some modicum of interest and, just think that's just never going to happen, is to do with extracurricular activities. The biggest distinction, probably, there are two big distinctions between most private schools and most state schools. The first is that most private schools, not all by any stretch of the imagination, but most private schools are selective. That's a big distinction. Then the other distinction is that once you're there, there's a package involved, and that package is a package of what's going on in the classroom, pastoral care, and also extracurricular activities. And extracurricular activities are absolutely the backbone of school: sport, music, things like debating and chess and dance and the pipe band and all these things. So what you do, and now why are there extracurricular activities in private schools, and in some state schools not very many? I've got to be careful what I say here. There are some extracurricular activities in most state schools, but it's not the same kind of level of provision at all.
It's not the same breadth or variety. I mean, that's a big draw of why people want to send their kids to private schools, isn't it? Yes,
exactly. So part of the reason for that is that in 1983 there was a huge teachers' strike in Scotland. I was very early in my teaching career. There was a huge teaching strike in Scotland, and a great many schools, part of the ruling was that teachers would work to rule, which meant they didn't do extracurriculars at all. It meant for 18 months there were no extracurricular activities in state schools. And when the dispute came to an end, a lot of these schools just didn't start doing extracurricular activities again, not to the same extent. Anyway, so what you have is a situation whereby teachers in private schools who are paid a bit more are, in essence, simply being paid to do extracurricular activities. You know, they get 5, 6, 7, up to 10% more on their salary, and that's because they work these hours extra, and they work these hours doing extracurricular activities. Now, if at the beginning of next academic session, you said to teachers in state schools, look, if you do an extracurricular activity already, you know, for, say, 2 hours a week or more, we are going to give you an extra 8% on your salary. You don't have to do this. You know, we're not saying everybody has to do it. But if you would like to start doing an extracurricular activity for up to 2 hours a week or 2 hours a week, we'll give you 8% on your salary. And then at some point in the future, you say new entrants to the profession must give an extracurricular activity and they get 8% more on their salary. Then that would be one of the ways of fulfilling lots of the objectives of curriculum for excellence. Yeah, the reason that young people coming out of private schools are confident, which is one of the objects of curriculum for excellence, the reason that people coming out of private schools are confident is because they take part in team games and they go to the orchestra and they are in plays and they do debating and all that kind of stuff. That's what makes them confident. It's not innate confidence. So that's one little idea which costs would cost in schools. I don't know how much it would cost, but it would relate to the teaching budget. You'd have to put the teaching budget up a bit to pay for it.
You could maybe get rid of Education Scotland to pay for it.
Well, I would say that was a brilliant trade-off.
Yeah.
I think getting rid of it, to be fair, I don't think getting rid of Education Scotland would quite cover that deficit. But I mean, 5 years of Education Scotland would cover a year of good extracurricular activities, and that would be well worthwhile, definitely. And there's any other of things like uniform, you know, disciplinary codes. The whole concept of punishment is a very interesting one, for example. Head teachers should be able to get rid of pupils in the state sector in a way that is extremely difficult for them to do. The issue of mainstream.
What would happen to those children?
Well, in the Wyllie world, here's what happens. So you go to school, and for one reason or another, you don't cope well with school. So let's say you fight a lot, or you're disruptive in class. That could be for medical or perimedical reasons. It could be because you've got ADHD, for example. It could be because you're somewhere on the autistic spectrum, potentially. Now, the way that the state deals with that at the moment is that sometimes, if you're lucky, you can have provision of a person to be with you in the classroom some of the time. I can't help but think that that's quite alienating for other pupils.
And it's quite stigmatizing, isn't it? Yeah,
absolutely. And I'm not sure it's more or less stigmatizing than actually being in a situation where you are separated out from other pupils and you go to some kind of hub, either within the school itself or within. Now, that model is used at some schools in Edinburgh, for example. I think I can't remember actually, but there are something like 4 or 5 schools that have language hubs which deal with say children on the autistic spectrum, and I think that's a very good thing, but there needs to be a great deal more investment in that. Children who are very badly behaved toward one using another, I mean, for most of these children, it's not their fault that they're very badly behaved. You know, there can be a lot of factors, social factors, familial factors going on. What I would personally do is I would have schools which children go to for a short, medium term where a lot of money is spent on these schools, and there are a lot of people there to help them and just talk them through it. And eventually the object should be for them to go back into mainstream education and to be better behaved or more responsible young people. Mm-hmm. But as it is, low level of discipline in Scottish schools is a huge problem, and it's not much talked about because teachers don't like to talk about it because they feel ashamed that they can't deal with it, but learning is interfered with, and every child has a right to learn, and that means that your nice lassie sitting at the front of the class or at the back of the class trying to learn just quite often can't do it. I saw lots of kids like that coming into Heriot's, often very good girls, and they came in because they wanted to learn and they couldn't learn because there was some objectionable brat of a boy who was making their life a misery in the maths class. Right, I say again, Zack.
Looking forward, what do you think is going to happen in education policy? More of the same?
Well, I'm not very confident that anything very much is going to happen, at least in the near future. Mm-hmm. I think there'll be a point eventually at which some opposition party seizes the initiative. I'm amazed that they've not done so. Mm-hmm. I think that if either the Labour Party or the Conservatives at the last Holyrood election had made education their main plank and just banged away at education, they'd have done better. Mm-hmm. Instead of which, it was all about the constitutional issue. They let the SNP lead the agenda on this. It's all about whether or not we want another referendum. A referendum takes place on one day and lasts 15 hours or whatever it is. You're talking about the whole life of young people.
It's always seemed to me that a referendum should be the beginning and not the end goal of policy. And, I certainly feel, as someone who voted for independence in the 2014 referendum, feel like not very much has been done to advance the argument since then about what would actually happen or to lay the groundwork.
Well, the argument, that's the point. The argument has not been advanced at all by the Scottish government. The argument's been advanced by the UK government being so crap. Mm-hmm. That's what's advanced the argument. Mm-hmm. The sheer horror of Boris, the terror of Priti Patel, the lunacy of Dominic Raab, all of these things. I mean, who wouldn't want us to be independent from that shower? But she's got to watch, because at the end of the day, they're not going to be in power in the UK. She must be absolutely banking on a further Conservative Party win at the next general election. And that's not an absolute given, because if she was up against a stolid, boring Labour Party, which is what that might have a slightly different signal.
Mm. I think this ties in nicely back to the point we were making about the problem of debating can sometimes be that you can debate any angle on any issue without any moral credibility. Yes. I wonder what's the answer to that? How do you make sure that you retain the skills of a good debater in terms of making convincing arguments, but also making those the right arguments to be making?
Well, I mean, there's no right argument to be making. If I believe something is right, so I'm in favour of abortion rights, for example, but I could argue, and I mean, I'm not a great debater, but young people who are skilled in debating could argue both sides of that very sensitive issue, just like that, just the drop of a hat, without revealing necessarily what they actually believe. I think what we've got to do is encourage young people to use debating skills to argue for what they believe in, regardless of what that is. I see.
So if people are a little bit less likely to just argue whatever side for the hell of it, really, and much more kind of think, well, what's important for me? What do I think is the right thing to do?
But debating is not just about that, of course. It's not just about your capacity to exhale a lot of hot air on one issue or another. It's also about the ability to examine evidence critically. I mean, critical thinking is very, very important. We need to be teaching that much more in schools so that they can see through all the shite that appears on social media.
Yeah, I feel like this is very important, actually. And
well, I mean, look at what's happening in America. I mean, what's happening in America is absolutely terrifying, I think. I mean, it's absolutely terrifying. It may be the case that, there have been so many things that happened in my lifetime, which I never expected to see, predominant among them, a black man becoming president of the United States of America. But it may be the case that in my lifetime, we see effectively the end of democracy in America. I mean, that could actually, I think, happen at the next American election.
Mm-hmm. How would you explain that a little bit more?
Well, I mean, I think if you take away people's voting rights, if you restrict people's voting rights, you engage only people who support one political party to do the counting in elections. You allow people to broadcast terrible lies through social media. And you have in charge of the Republican Party, potentially, again, as the nominee, a man who is, in my view, clearly mentally ill. Then, you know, the comparisons are all too obvious with, you know, what could happen, where an uneducated, broadly uneducated class, fueled by very, very, very rich people, comes to have a great deal of power. I think it's just awful. I think it's just terrifying.
And it sounds like what we can do to inoculate ourselves against that a little bit is to.
Well, I don't think we're really quite in that position, because whatever is, I mean, a lot of unpleasant things have happened. I mean, there are some comparisons with the whole issue of the Brexit vote, maybe, but I still come back to the idea that the thing which will have most encouraged people to think about voting yes in the Scottish referendum who did not previously vote yes is A, Brexit, and B, Boris. And these two things are obviously clearly very, very closely aligned. So that's, you know, that's where Scotland lies at the moment. But you see, that's where Scotland lies. Scotland lies in, Europe, the Constitution, the UK government, and education is just nowhere. I mean, it's just nowhere.
Yeah. And yeah, I think education, and specifically those critical thinking skills we were talking about, are really important for determining what public policy should be, I think. And if those things are getting left behind, and that critical appraisal of evidence is being left behind, I feel like that was the biggest thing that I got out of my education at Heriot's, the ability to at least think of both sides of the argument, think about scientific evidence. You know, and really the scientific evidence part with the pandemic has become important. How do you tell what's a good paper from what's not?
But remember, you were also very clever. So the point is, you started off by being a very clever little boy, and at the end of the day, imagine what it's like if you're not just quite so skilled intellectually in the first place, because the capacity to be more easily led is clearly down there. And I mean, I do worry about that a lot. I mean, I think that's just going to be what happens.
I have hope that if we can make those skills more accessible for people who, you know, have a variety of different academic skills, then that would probably be better, and maybe people would be a bit less easily led, and you know, be able to think a bit more for themselves.
Well, of course, I mean, the point is there is some hope. I mean, I am involved to a very limited extent in a program called Speak Up Scotland, which is run by an organisation called Young Speakers Scotland, which used to be the English Speaking Union in Scotland, and it basically goes into schools which do not have a tradition of schools debating, and encourages young people to have the confidence to stand up and argue. And a lot of these are schools which would certainly fall into the government's definition of being schools where we need to be tackling the poverty-related attainment gap. So hopefully that little thing has some little effect. And if it was encouraged on a much bigger scale, or indeed if it could find government funding, then it would, you know, it could prevail. It could do a lot of good.
That seems like quite a nice point to start tying up on. And
that's kind of what I was thinking.
Yeah, and I always end with a final question, which is if there's a book that you think people should go and read that touches on some of the topics that we've been talking about, what would that book be?
Well, that's... well, my own book on teaching is going to be published in June, but the book that I would encourage people to read at the moment is by, just give me 1 second, I can never say this man's name, James McKennany, and it's called Class Rules. Mr. McKennany comes from a completely different angle on lots of things to do with education, but he's very good at pointing out what's terrible about Scottish education at the moment. So that's what I'd recommend.
And what's your book going to be called when it comes out?
My book's going to be called, yes, my book's not going to be called anything clever like that. My book's going to be called "Is There a Pigeon in the Room?" And it's going to be a book about me as a teacher. It's not going to have much to say about education. I might write a book about education eventually, but I would hesitate to do that. Okay, well, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you, Mr. Wyllie. And you, Zack, too. Now go off and cure some people, and I'll go off and have a nap. Okay.